Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Bright on Buddhism. This week we will be reading and discussing Chapter 8 of Thomas Cleary's translation of the Avatamsaka Sutra. In this chapter, we see a deeper explanation of the Four Noble Truths given by Manjushri, one of the most highly advanced of the Buddha's 10 original disciples. Here, Manjushri is actually preaching the Four Noble Truths to the Bodhisattvas in assembly, called by Thomas Cleary as enlightening beings. He preaches on the meanings of these truths in the context of worlds other than just our own. In this translation, our world is rendered with the name endurance, with a capital E. This is a translation of Saha, which just means the world of persistent and enduring suffering, where the Buddha appears to enlighten beings. However, this sutra is given to the entirety of the Dharma realm, meaning that Manjushri is also called upon to explain the Four Noble Truths in the context of worlds besides our own. Other worlds include undefiled, rarefied, and doorbolt. These are renderings of the names of other realms of sentient beings contained in the totality of the Dharma realm. Important note on the names in this chapter. Just like the other chapter that we've read, Thomas Cleary elects to do something we have talked about before on the show, where he translates the names of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas directly, for meaning, with only a few exceptions. An example of this is translating Samantabhadra's name as Bodhisattva Universally Good. This is a practice that infuriates many scholars of Buddhism, including myself. The reasons why are that nobody translates anybody's names that way in real life, and because translations are totally subjective. So if you want to ask, hey, what other texts does Bodhisattva Great Brilliance of the Light of the Moon Reflected in the Ocean come up in? Then all I can say is good luck to you. Oddly enough, many figures, such as Vairocana and Manjushri, have their names remain untranslated. Anyways, I hope you enjoy. Then the great enlightening being Manjushri said to the enlightening beings, "Children of Buddhas, the holy truth of suffering in this world endurance is sometimes called wrongdoing, or oppression, or change, or clinging to objects, or accumulation, or thorns stabbing, or dependence on the senses, or deceit, or the place of cancer, or ignorant action. The holy truth of the cause of the accumulation of suffering in this world endurance may be called bondage, or disintegration, or attachment to goods, or false consciousness, or pursuit and involvement, or conviction, or the web, or fancified conceptualizing, or following, or awry faculties. The holy truth of the extinction of suffering in this world endurance may be called non-contention, or freedom from defilement, or tranquility and dispassion, or signlessness, or deathlessness, or the absence of inherent nature, or absence of hindrance, or extinction, or essential reality, or abiding in one's own essence. The holy truth of the path of the extinction of suffering in this world endurance may be called the one vehicle, or progress towards serenity, or guidance, or ultimate freedom from discrimination, or equanimity, or putting down the burden, or having no object of pursuit, or following the intent of the saint, or the practice of the sages, or 10 treasuries. In this world, there are 4 quadrillion such names to express the 4 holy truths in accord with the mentalities of sentient beings, to cause them all to be harmonized and pacified. What in this world is called the holy truth of suffering is, in that world, secret teaching, called the sense of striving and seeking, or not being emancipated, or the root of bondage, or doing what shouldn't be done, or contending and struggling in all manner of situations, or total lack of power to analyze, or being depended on, or extreme pain, or hyperactivity, or things with form. What is called the holy truth of the accumulation of suffering is, in that world, secret teaching, called following birth and death, or habitual attachment, or burning, or continuous revolving, or corrupt senses, or continuing existences, or evil behavior, or emotional attachment, or the source of illness, or categorization. What is called the holy truth of the extinction of suffering is, in that world, secret teaching, also called the ultimate truth, or emancipation, or praiseworthy, or peace, or the place good to enter, or docility, or singleness, or faultlessness, or freedom from greed, or resolution. What is called the holy truth of the path to extinction of suffering is, in that world, secret teaching, also called bold generalship, or superior action, or transcendence, or having skill in means, or impartial eye, or detachment from extremes, or comprehensive understanding, or inclusion, or supreme I, or contemplating the Four Truths. In the World Secret Teaching, there are 4 quadrillion such names to explain the Four Holy Truths, to cause sentient beings to be harmonized and pacified according to their mentalities. What is in this world endurance, called the Holy Truth of Suffering, is in the world abundance, also called fear, or individual mortality, or disgusting, or what should be worked on, or change, or ensnaring enemy, or deceptive usurper, or hard to work with, or false discrimination, or possessor of power. What is called the Holy Truth of the accumulation of suffering is, in that world abundance, called corruption, or ignorance, or great enemy, or sharp blade, or taste of destruction, or revenge, or not one's own thing, or bad guidance, or increasing darkness, or ruining goodness. What is called the Holy Truth of the extinction of suffering is, in that world abundance, called great meaning, or benefit, or goal of goals, or infinity, or what should be seen, or detachment from discrimination, or supreme pacification, or constant equanimity, or worthy of living together, or non-fabrication. What is called the Holy Truth of the path to extinction of suffering is, in that world abundance, called able to burn up, or the highest class, or certitude, or unbreakable, or profound techniques, or emancipation, or not mean or base, or mastery, or essence of liberation, or capable of setting free. In that world abundance, there are 4 quadrillion such names to explain the Four Holy Truths, to cause sentient beings to be harmonized and pacified according to their mentalities. What is in this world endurance, called the Holy Truth of Suffering, is, in the world undefiled, also called regret, or dependency, or aggravation, or dwelling within walls, or one flavor, or untruth, or living at home, or abode of deluded attachment, or false views, or innumerable. What is called the Holy Truth of accumulation of suffering is, in the world undefiled, also called no real thing, or only having words, or not pure, or place of birth, or grasping, or baseness, or increase, or heavy burden, or producer, or roughness. What is called the Holy Truth of the extinction of suffering is, in the world undefiled, also called incomparable, or thoroughly cleared, or removal of defilement, or supreme faculties, or harmony, or independence, or extinction of confusion, or most excellent, or the ultimate, or breaking the seal. What is called the Holy Truth of the path to the extinction of suffering is, in that world undefiled, called something indestructible, or the part of appropriate means, or the basis of liberation, or reality of basic nature, or the blameless, or the most pure, or the boundary of all existences, or maintaining what is received complete, or producing the ultimate, or pure discernment. In the world undefiled, there are 4 quadrillion such names to explain the Four Holy Truths, to cause all sentient beings to be harmonized and pacified according to their mentalities. What is in this world endurance, called the Holy Truth of Suffering, is, in the world rich pleasure, also called the place of emotional attachment, or root of danger and harm, or the sectors of the ocean of existence, or made by accumulation, or discriminating senses, or aggravation, or origination and destruction, or hindrance, or base of sword blades, or made of sets. What is called the Holy Truth of the accumulation of suffering is, in the world rich pleasure, called detestable, or names, or endless, or different sets, or not to be loved, or able to grab and bite, or crude things, or emotional attachment, or receptacle, or stirring. What is called the Holy Truth of the extinction of suffering is, in that world rich pleasure, called end of continuation, or revelation, or no label, or nothing to practice, or no object of vision, or non-doing, or extinction, or already burned out, or cast off the heavy burden, or purged. What is called the Holy Truth of the path to extinction of suffering is, in that world rich pleasure, called serene action, or emancipating action, or diligent practice and experience, or gone to tranquility, or infinite life, or comprehensive knowledge, or the ultimate path, or difficult to practice, or reaching the other shore, or invincible. In the world rich pleasure there are 4 quadrillion such names to explain the 4 holy truths, to cause all sentient beings to be harmonized and pacified according to their mentalities. What is in this world endurance, called the holy truth of suffering, is in the world inclusion, also called able to plunder and usurp, or not a good friend, or full of fear, or various fancies, or the nature of hell, or untruth, or the burden of covetousness, or roots of deep gravity, or changing with moods, or fundamental vanity. What is called the holy truth of the accumulation of suffering is called, in that world inclusion, greedy attachment, or wrong accomplishment, or the evil of excess, or nothing that can be explained, or nothing that can be apprehended, or continuous revolving in circles. What is called the holy truth of extinction of suffering is, in the world inclusion, called non-regression, or beyond speech, or formless, or enjoyable, or stability, or supreme wonder, or freedom from folly, or extinction, or detachment from evil, or escape. What is called the holy truth of the path to extinction of suffering is, in the world inclusion, called beyond words, or non-contention, or teaching and guidance, or good dedication, or great skill, or a variety of techniques, or space-like, or serene action, or supreme knowledge, or ability to understand truth. In the world inclusion, there are 4 quadrillion such names to explain the 4 holy truths, to cause sentient beings to be harmonized and pacified according to their mentalities. What is in this world endurance, called the holy truth of suffering, is in the world beneficial, also called heavy burden, or instability, or like a robber, or aging and death, or made of craving, or transmigration, or fatigue, or bad condition, or growth, or the sharp blade. What is called the holy truth of the accumulation of suffering is, in the world beneficial, called decay, or confusion, or regression, or powerlessness, or loss, or opposition, or disharmony, or doing, or grasping, or wishing. What is called the holy truth of the extinction of suffering is, in the world beneficial, also called escape from prison, or real truth, or freedom from troubles, or protection, or detachment from ill, or docility, or the fundamental, or abandoning the cause, or non-striving, or non-continuation. What is called the holy truth of the path to the extinction of suffering is, in that world beneficial, also called arriving at non-existence, or the seal of the totality, or the treasury of meditation, or attainment of light, or the non-regressive state, or the ability to put an end to being, or the wide great road, or ability to tame, or having peace and security, or non-routinized faculties. In the world beneficial, there are 4 quadrillion such names to explain the 4 holy truths, to cause sentient beings to be harmonized and pacified according to their mentalities. What is in this world endurance, called the holy truth of suffering, is in the world rarefied, also called dangerous desires, or place of bondage, or misguided action, or receptivity, or shamelessness, or rooted in greed, or the ever-flowing river, or constant disintegration, or the nature of torch fire, or full of stress and anxiety. What is called the holy truth of the accumulation of suffering is, in that world, called broad ground, or tendency, or distance from wisdom, or obstruction, or fear, or laxity, or taking in, or attachment, or ignorance being master of the house, or continuous bonds. What is called the holy truth of the extinction of suffering is, in that world, also called fulfillment, or immortality, or selflessness, or absence of inherent nature, or end of discrimination, or abode of peace and happiness, or infinitude, or cutting off transmigration, or cutting off compulsive mental activity, or non-duality. What is called the holy truth of the path to the extinction of suffering is, in that world, also called great light, or ocean of explanation, or analyzing meaning, or the way of harmony, or freedom from attachment, or breaking the continuum, or the broad highway, or the basis of impartiality, or pure methods, or supreme insight. In that world rarefied are 4 quadrillion such names to explain the 4 holy truths, to cause sentient beings to be harmonized and pacified according to their mentalities. What is in this world endurance, called the holy truth of suffering, is in the world joy, called continuous revolving, or birth, or loss of benefit, or habitual attachment, or the heavy load, or discrimination, or inward danger, or gathering, or wrong abode, or of the nature of misery and affliction. What is called the holy truth of the accumulation of suffering is in that world also called the ground, or conveniences, or wrong timing, or untruth, or bottomless, or possessiveness, or departure from morality, or afflictions, or narrow views, or accumulation of defilement. What is called the holy truth of the extinction of suffering is in that world called destroying dependency, or not indulging, or truth, or equality, or purity, or freedom from sickness, or undistorted, or formless, or free, or birthless. What is called the holy truth of the path to extinction of suffering is in that world called entering the supreme realm, or cutting off accumulation, or transcending comparison, or vast nature, or end of discrimination, or the path of spiritual power, or multitude of appropriate techniques, or practice of right mindfulness, or the ever-quiet road, or embracing liberation. In that world joy there are 4 quadrillion such names to explain the 4 holy truths, to cause beings to be harmonized and pacified according to their mentalities. What is in this world endurance, called the holy truth of suffering, is in the world door-bolt, also called decaying form, or like a broken vessel, or the product of ego, or embodiment of various tendencies, or numerous routines, or the gate of the multitude of ills, or inherent pain, or that which should be abandoned, or flavorlessness, or coming and going. What is called the holy truth of the accumulation of suffering is in that world called activity, or the poison of anger, or conglomeration, or sensation, or selfishness, or mixed poison, or empty names, or opposition, or imitation, or astonishment. What is called the holy truth of the extinction of suffering is in that world called no accumulation, or ungraspable, or wonder medicine, or incorruptible, or non-attachment, or immeasurable, or vast, or the sphere of awakening, or freedom from addiction, or absence of obstruction. What is called the holy truth of the path to extinction of suffering is in that world called peaceful action, or detachment from craving, or ultimate reality, or entry into truth, or the essential ultimate, or manifestation of purity, or concentration, or heading for liberation, or salvation, or supreme action. In that world door-bolt, there are 4 quadrillion such names to express the 4 holy truths, to cause sentient beings to be harmonized and pacified according to their mentalities. What is in this world endurance, called the holy truth of suffering, is in the world shaking sound, also called hidden sickness, or the mundane, or the dwelling place, or conceit, or the nature of habitual attachment, or the torrent, or unenjoyable, or hypocrisy, or the evanescent, or difficult to control. What is called the holy truth of the accumulation of suffering is in that world called that which must be controlled, or mental tendencies, or that which binds, or arising in every thought, or extending to the future, or combination, or discrimination, or the gateway, or blown by the wind, or concealment. What is called the holy truth of the extinction of suffering is in that world called no reliance, or ungraspable, or returning, or freedom from conflict, or small, or great, or pure, or inexhaustible, or broad, or priceless. What is called the holy truth of the path to extinction of suffering is in that world called analytic observation, or ability to destroy the enemy, or seal of knowledge, or ability to enter the essence, or unopposable, or limitless meaning, or able to enter knowledge, or the path of harmony, or eternal imperturbability, or the highest truth. In that world's shaking sound, there are 4 quadrillion such names to explain the 4 holy truths, to cause sentient beings to be harmonized and pacified according to their mentalities. Just as in this world endurance, there are 4 quadrillion names to express the 4 holy truths, so in all the worlds to the east, hundreds of thousands of billions, countlessly, innumerably, boundlessly, incomparably, incalculably, unspeakably, inconceivably, immeasurably, inexplicably many worlds. In each, there are an equal number of names to express the four holy truths, to cause the sentient beings there to all be harmonized and pacified in accordance with their mentalities. And just as this is so of the worlds to the east, so it is with all the infinite worlds in the 10 directions. That was Chapter 8 of the Avatamsaka Sutta, known as Four Noble Truths. Docs, what do you think?
This was an interesting one, just thinking about this from the translator's perspective. So we've talked in the past that we don't like it when proper names are translated literally most of the time. We've already made that point, so I see no need to go into it into detail here. But for this specific chapter of this specific sutta, I'm not sure if there was another way it could be done and have any useful content for an English speaker. Because if you weren't doing that kind of translation, then what we would have would just be a bunch of Pali titles or Sanskrit titles with no meaning that we could really discern from it. So I think that's kind of the only way to do it for this kind of chapter.
I see where you're coming from. I would have really liked for the titles of the worlds to be left in the original language, because that helps me contextualize what locations in the Buddhist cosmology we're talking about. I can understand leaving the other ways to call the Four Noble Truths translated for meaning, right? Because that's kind of what this sutta is about, is different characteristics or aspects of each of these Four Noble Truths in these different worlds. But I would have loved to see, for example, in the world undefiled, is that the Tushita heaven where Maitreya lives? Or is that the Triyastrimsa heaven, where other bodhisattvas live? Or is that the realm of, the Asuras or the gods? Where is that in the cosmology? That's where I would have liked to see some Sanskrit or some Pali in here.
Yeah, and the different names given don't really tell us much about the location. It's interesting, we have things like inclusion, abundance, rarefied, joy, and then we have Doorbolt.
Yeah.
There's a story there that we're not getting.
Yeah, and translating for meaning definitely doesn't give us any of that kind of crucial information. Another place where we've seen some of this kind of translating for meaning or names that seem innocuous or like non sequiturs to us in the esoteric sutras that we've read and discussed. For example, in the Adamantine Pinnacle Sutta, a lot of the place names and people names had to do with these like innocuous sounding nouns, such as like Doorbolt. There was always some sort of meaning having to do with the action of the Buddha or the Bodhisattva who is associated with that noun or with that name or that place. And in this case, Doorbolt could be like the world of hidden Dharma secrets or something like that. But again, we don't get that context here. So it would have been nice to see those in Sanskrit to be able to, refer back.
Yeah, I agree that having the place names left as original would probably be clearer. It's also just difficult to, in one's head, remember that when in this paragraph the word inclusion is the name of a place rather than a quality being discussed. The same thing for beneficial and so on.
Mm-hmm.
These are all words that would be used to describe Buddhist ideas, and here they're place names, and it's just that little bit harder to understand. But aside from the place names, like translating the different names for the Four Noble Truths, again, if we didn't have that, it would just be a list of names that, or words that we don't have any connection to. So again, that part, what else are you going to do? And also how difficult that process would be, because a lot of these adjectives and descriptors, they have a subjective quality to them that perhaps tells us more about the translator than what is being translated.
In some cases, I would agree, yeah. And, it's good to have like you say, this context with meaning involved, because the Four Noble Truths are given in the original language as just individual words: dukkha, samudaya, nirodha, marga. Those are the four, right? And they don't tell you by themselves all of the rest of the stuff that's kind of included with those meanings, right? Like dukkha, we talked about so much in the context of it being not just like agony and regular suffering, but, this innate characteristic of existence that's due to impermanence. And then, samudaya, that word just means cause or origin. So that doesn't tell you like the answer, which is that like dukkha is caused by attachment and desire. And then similarly, nirodha is just like similar to a word that you would use for putting out a fire, like every day putting out a fire. That doesn't tell you, it's referring to the fact that dukkha has an ending. And then marga is the same that we would refer to road or path or way to get somewhere. Again, without context, it doesn't tell you that we're referring specifically to the Noble Eightfold Path. And each of these names for all these different Four Noble Truths in these different worlds, they are probably given as one or two names in the original language. And so pulling them apart and translating them out this way is really a tough job. And I think that it actually shook out pretty well, because it gives you at least glimpses of these other aspects of the Four Noble Truths that you may not have gotten before. And I really appreciate that. And so what we're going to be spending most of this discussion doing is picking out those names that we thought were pretty interesting in these other worlds for the Four Noble Truths. And we're going to kind of discuss how they may relate to what we know about those truths. So, Docs, are there any that you wanted to start with in particular?
So, I'm going to be skipping around in the order in this, but the first thing I wanted to point out were a couple that I think have anachronistic words. So, the one that most stood out to me is in the world of inclusion. One of the names for the Noble Truth of Suffering is Roots of Deep Gravity. I get the feeling that gravity is a word that the translator used kind of reading back into the original text. Would there have been a Buddhist way to refer to the force of gravity, or a force that is keeping us on the planet?
That's a good question, and that's a good poll to start with. This one is actually not referring to the force of physics, gravity. It's actually referring to graveness.
Oh.
Gravity is sometimes used as meaning something's very grave.
Okay.
And so, yeah, it's the roots of that which is grave.
Yeah, okay, that makes more sense. I would say that's not a good choice on the translator's part. That could be translated as like you said, grave, serious, threatening, something like that. My writer brain is refusing to kick in right now. Normally I would try to have a synonym that works, but there's got to be a better way to have said that if what he's talking about is like the severity of a situation.
Yeah, and I think that he purposefully leaves it interpretive in a way that brings in that anachronistic aspect, because in that same world inclusion, the fourth noble truth about the path, one of the names is space-like.
Yeah, that's another one I was going to bring up.
Exactly. And again, it's not talking about outer space as in beyond Earth's atmosphere. It's talking about how essentially the path is unconditioned. I think that when we did our episodes on the four jhanas, the four rupa jhanas and the four arupa jhanas, we talked about how these jhanas are describing and signaling to that which is conditioned, and space, the physical property of space, the fact that, there is volume, 3 dimensions in the world, that is an unconditioned phenomenon. And the path, the Eightfold Path, is similarly unconditioned. And by saying it's unconditioned, it just means that it's true all the time, no matter what. The Dharma itself is unconditioned. It's not subject to context, causation, impermanence, emptiness, etc. It's just what it is. And you could have translated that in another way too, right? But then with this gravity aspect, I think that he wanted to, elicit imagery about outer space and the cosmos a little bit. And that just doesn't sit right with me. It doesn't seem like that's what this is referring to.
Yeah, that was one of the next ones I was going to bring up. Another one that seemed kind of anachronistic. In the world Doorbolt, the Noble's Truth of Suffering is, among other things, called Product of Ego. Now, I can see ego as being, pride in oneself. Perhaps hubris might be an equivalent word here. But also, like when we talk about ego, we're talking about the origin of the word, as I understand it, is Freudian, id, ego, superego. So that seems mildly anachronistic, but also in everyday life, when we're talking about somebody who has an ego, that is somebody who thinks that they are important. So that could, now that we've already talked about the different way of interpreting the word gravity, you could also do the same thing with ego here.
Yeah, and, I agree this is anachronistic, but, unfortunately I have seen this in other translations from other translators. And to that extent, I do let it slide a little bit. I don't like it either, but I think that it's a very good shorthand for what it really refers to, which is a diluted image of the importance and persistence and substance of self, right? This kind of misunderstanding of non-self, of emptiness. And that's directly pointing to the fact that suffering comes from delusion, and it's delusion that causes desire, and desire that causes attachment, and then you're stuck in the loop. So ego here is, it's referring to that image of self, and it comes up a lot. Unfortunately, Buddhist studies and translation of religious texts from East Asia and South Asia, it is very much tied to the same kind of imperial academia that Freud came up in. And a lot of these people study Freud for his theories of religion and for his theories about like different cultures, as well as for psychology. And it just kind of bleeds over a lot. And there's kind of ongoing work in Buddhist studies and in translation studies to pull all that stuff out of there, because it's not terribly useful anymore. It's not really a good way to look at other cultures and other religious traditions and other concepts, because, it's applying this very Western style theorization that comes up in, the 19th century and doesn't belong in the time period that this material comes from.
So, a couple of other names I noted coming up a few times. So, we have a lot of talk of infinity in various spots in these names. And we also see immortality in, this is in The World Rarefied, The Extinction of Dukkha. One of the things it's called is immortality. And that feels like or something very close to a violation of impermanence, because the whole thing about impermanence is that nothing is truly immortal, and you're not going to actually reach infinity because impermanent. You'll be dead before you can get there. So that seemed interesting. I get that there has to be some way of saying an unlimited number of stuff, but it's also like me being very particular about the definition of words. That's not quite correct.
Yeah, that's a good pull as well. A lot of our criticisms about the concept of immortality when it comes up in Buddhism are the result of changes that take place in Mahayana Buddhism. We talk a lot about how there's a huge amount of straw manning and like interdenominational sniping and just kind of nasty language used from the Mahayana side about earlier schools of Buddhism. And a lot of it is unfounded in a lot of ways, right? We've discussed how a lot of it is extreme and it's a misrepresentation and it's problematic because everybody's on the same side and there's just no need for disagreements to turn into attacks like that. But this is actually one of the few substantial and substantiated kinds of critiques in early schools of Buddhism from around this time period where we had the authorship of this sutra. There were some schools of Buddhism that believed that enlightenment resulted in immortality, or that nirvana was a kind of immortality. And they described it explicitly in the texts as such. And it wasn't until later that people came around and started saying what we're saying now, which is that immortality violates impermanence. we've talked about nirvana as a being put out or blown out, like a flame being extinguished. And that's how it's talked about often in the text. And we think of that as, kind of like this non-existence. It's not non-existence. It's like a complete liberation, absence, extinguishing from samsara. But early schools sometimes thought about samsara as one world and then nirvana as another world, like a separate world where you achieve continued existence, like somewhere where you go after you die, kind of like how Abrahamic religions consider heaven. There's like this realm, and then you reach immortality or eternity in that other realm. And they eventually kind of died out. The group and the sects that thought that, they were eventually kind of just disbanded. People kind of migrated to other sects, or the number of followers diminished to the point where it became historically insignificant or stuff like that. And eventually Mahayana came in and kind of put the final nail in the coffin and said, nirvana is not another world where you achieve eternity and immortality. And immortality itself is just a wrong idea in what we're now calling Buddhism.
So let's see, any others that I particularly wanted to poke at? So in the world undefiled, the truth of suffering is sometimes called one flavor, dwelling within walls, and living at home. So, leaving one flavor aside for a second, dwelling within walls and living at home, those are interesting names for the noble truth of suffering. I get an idea that what's being conveyed here, or what's attempting to be conveyed here, is limitation, being fettered at one's home, dwelling within walls that limit your perception. But I'm not sure how much of that is me reading back what I know from having done all of this studying already into this, or if they mean like, no, living at home is one of the symptoms and or causes of dukkha.
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say that the metaphorical aspect of being subject to limits on your perception and being stuck in one place, because of delusion and because of dukkha, that's definitely being referred to here. But then there also could potentially be an actual historical, like literal way to look at this. So living at home entails that you haven't renounced to become a monk. And so their definition or their names for the path could imply the process of starting out being a householder and like an everyday person, and then eventually figuring out how to renounce and leave all of your worldly possessions and attachments behind and become a monastic. So there's kind of that aspect. Because there's so many names for each of the Four Noble Truths in each of these different worlds, it's hard to draw linear threads between these names in the truths. So we have living at home, but then if we jump to the path for undefiled, we may or may not find something that kind of implies renouncing and becoming a monk. But these names sometimes harp on those cultural aspects. And it's very interesting to think about that because, we're seeing an ancient / medieval society looking at or speculating about these other worlds, these other heavens or these other realms that they, have no experiential verification about. Like they haven't been to these places. They can't go to these places in a literal sense. And they're kind of imposing their own cultural perspectives onto these places. They're imagining an alien world where there's the very human behavior of living in a home and then renouncing and becoming a monastic, like they did in Indian culture for so many centuries, before, during, and after Buddhism came about. And it's interesting to think about from a creative perspective because they're speculating. This is one way to read this is kind of like speculative fiction in a way.
Yeah, I got some of that as well. There's definitely a big speculative aspect of this just because these names start a scaffold of an idea and it leaves huge hunks of the work to the reader to do to finish filling that skeleton.
Absolutely, yeah. It's fascinating stuff. I think that I don't know, I like that they engage with this sort of stuff, but I also I think that it can sometimes turn some people off when they're reading it and kind of make it harder to understand. And that's why translation is something that needs to be done very carefully.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is definitely not one that I would put in front of a new reader, because it's a lot of information kept in a very dense format, but it's also not complete information, and in many cases not particularly important information.
Yeah, it doesn't convey as much as it potentially could.
It sounds like it conveys a lot when you're reading it or listening to it, but then when you start to pick it apart, not really.
Definitely.
Let's see, a couple more little things I noted. So, in the world of rich pleasure, one of the names for the extinction of dukkha is nothing to practice, and then one of the names for the path to the extinction of dukkha is difficult to practice. So, that's a case where I could see a lot of different Buddhist answers to that contradiction. There's ways to talk about emptiness or non-duality that makes it so that these two apparently exclusive ideas can be next to each other just fine. And it can also be a matter of the translator struggling to put something into words that is not so clear in English. And there are a couple of other instances where you have slightly contradictory ideas in different sections of these.
Yeah, I really like this one because it seems on a superficial level like it is reversing the way that we think about those last two. So, those last two truths, extinction is the truth of the existence of the end of dukkha. It's just speaking to the fact that dukkha can stop, and the path is how to stop it. But this is referring to extinction, the third noble truth, as kind of the end state. And in that end state, you don't have anything to practice, so to speak. There's some perspectives of enlightenment that think of Buddhahood or enlightenment as a state where you have reached the pinnacle and you're good to go. You don't have to do anything else. You don't have to exert yourself anymore because you've made it into that state and you're locked in. So if we apply that way of thinking to this, then extinction is that state, and then the path to that extinction is the hard part. It's the part where you're doing all of that work. And that's why I would say difficult to practice. And that's fascinating to me because all other kind of exegeses of the Four Noble Truth, they think of them very linearly, and they put action items onto each one, but they regard them in this fashion of sequential realization. And it's the beginning of the path. So these are like the first 4 steps you have to go on, and it starts you on for the rest. But instead, we're looking at it here as like, this is every possible path state. And incidentally, the third noble truth is the chronologically final path state.
So if we get into every name that I thought was interesting, we'd be here for several days. So I think I'm going to let that be my parts done. But what about you? Are there any names that came up in here that you want to poke at?
The ones that interested me for this case were the ones that were repeated in a couple of different worlds. So we have, as an example, we have docility that comes up a few times. Docility is a name for accumulation in the world beneficial. And then in the other world, secret teaching, it's also called docility. This time, instead of being accumulation, the second noble truth, it's the third noble truth, which is extinction of suffering. And it's interesting to see that concept applied to 2 different parts. So looking at secret teaching in the beginning, the extinction of suffering being docility makes sense. In that state of nirodha, of awakening, of cessation, we would be docile, and our mind would be docile. It would not be acting on delusion. It wouldn't be crafting delusion or crafting an image of self, capital S self, that doesn't exist, that sort of thing. It speaks to being in a state of peace, relatively. But then if we look at the world beneficial and we look at the accumulation of suffering, we look at desire being the cause of suffering and leading to its continued increase, then in this case, calling that docility is kind of a reimagination of what docility actually means and how it applies here. So this may be a translation issue that I'm making more of than is necessary, but Here, I think that accumulation being called docility, the second noble truth being called docility, speaks to the fact that you're complacent in that state before you have started the path and achieved nirvana. So maybe you should have said complacency here as the translator. I don't know. But it's interesting to think that in this state, it's possible to be docile as well. Another way to look at it is that in a state of delusion, it's possible to be okay with being in that state. And so you're kind of deluded about your own delusion and thus docile and not trying to break out of it. And that's another way to express complacency. But it's like the good and the bad of docility or complacency, reflected in these two different worlds names for the accumulation of suffering and the extinction of suffering.
Yeah, it might be that a better set of words could have been complacency for what we were talking about, and then for the positive aspect of docility, it could be something like peacefulness, contentedness, fulfillment, like a sense that the work is done.
That makes sense here. I still think that we could have used complacency at least in one of those two cases rather than docility both times, but I don't know, maybe it's calling on the reader to think in this sort of way.
Yeah, I just double-checked with Find. Complacency does not come up in the text, so that word could and probably should have been used, because there absolutely is a complacent aspect in the accumulation of suffering.
Totally. Yeah, that makes sense.
Any others you wanted to do?
Yeah. Another one that I wanted to touch on was another one that you had listed here in our notes, which is in the world of abundance, the truth of dukkha is called possessor of power. And there's nothing repeated or there's nothing that's sort of hard to grasp at here. But I do like that it is, in a way, psychologizing the truth of dukkha, because it's implying the fact that in a state of dukkha and delusion, in that feedback loop that is caused by suffering and its accumulation, you find that the delusions and that the dukkha do have power over your behavior and over your way of looking at the world. And you have to break out of that, according to Buddhism, in order to achieve enlightenment and Buddhahood. And so even though there is no inherent capital S self to dukkha as a concept, still it can have undue power over your behavior and over your belief system and perspectives. And even though it's not a living thing, it is often personified or anthropomorphized in Buddhist mythology. Dukkha is, simply for the fact of giving it a face and characteristics so that on a very rudimentary and simple level, you can point at it and say, this is the bad guy. Or like, this is the guy that embodies that which is making your life bad. And this is what we have to overcome. I think that Mara, as a deity who we've talked about before, in some ways is also a personification of dukkha and is, of course, the god of death and the god of desire. And in that way, I think that it's personifying these very real psychological or emotional conditions that we need to overcome in order to reach this state of enlightenment.
I was also thinking about it as a matter of having power causes dukkha. Because if you possess power, then if you're trying to be a benevolent person with power, that puts a lot of pressure on you to use that power wisely. Whereas if you are not trying to be a benevolent wielder of power, then you're probably using that power to accumulate wealth and, things of desire, which just increases desire even more. So I was thinking about that as much as power is something that causes dukkha. And at least until the end of the process, most of the path to becoming enlightened is putting oneself in a state of relative powerlessness. The Buddha has a whole lot of sway over the world, but a monk who has just joined in and is at the beginning stages, like, what are they going to do? Like, what power could they possibly wield over the rest of the world? They're kind of putting themselves in a state of low power on purpose, because that's part of getting out of the loop, is relinquishing that desire for power.
Yeah, I think that's equally true.
Any more you want to put up?
Yeah, let's see here. I think I'm good.
All right. So that was all the things that I wanted to talk about enough to actually talk about on this episode. There are several others that I noted that we didn't go over, but we've already been at this for a while, and if we wanted to, we could spend an arbitrary amount of time dissecting this. So I think I'm good if you are.
I'm good to go. Yeah, there's many more to discuss, but I think that a lot of them are very straightforward, and we got to all the ones I wanted to get to as well. So I think that I'm good to go as well.
All right. Well, that has been our discussion of Chapter 8 of the Flower Garland Sutra. Listeners, thank you as always, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.
If you like our show and want to support us financially, we ask that you instead send that support to a worthy cause. In our previous charity throw, we directed listeners to the GoFundMe for Keith Porter Jr., a man murdered by ICE earlier this year. Between posting that and recording this message, ICE has murdered yet more people. Unfortunately, there will be even more in the near future. Changing our message for every victim of these fascist thugs is not logistically possible for us. Instead of directing to a specific person, we encourage listeners to donate to whichever ICE victim's fundraiser that has the least amount at the time you donate. If we can find them, we will have links to all of these fundraisers in the show notes. At the time of recording, the list of people murdered by ICE in 2026 includes Victor Manuel Diaz, Geraldo Lunas, Luis Gustavo Nunez, Luis Beltran Yanez, Herbert Sanchez Dominguez, Parody La, Keith Porter Jr., Alex Pretty, and Renee Good. We can get through this. Our strongest weapon is solidarity. Stay strong and help where you can. Thank you.
My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and voice of Hearer.
And I'm Docs, editor, question asker, and voice of Hermit.
And this is Med Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have a question you'd like us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment or review, subscribing, or joining us on social media. Email us at bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com or find us on Mastodon at brightbuddhism@mstdn.party. As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.